Welcome to this channel, which is devoted to a reading and better understanding of the book Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross. And today we're up to the third book, the 16th chapter. And as you recall, in past chapters, St. John instructed us to darken our understanding so that we might learn via the virtue of faith. In more recent chapters, he instructed us to purge our memory in order to ground it in hope. Now, in order to clarify, hope is a virtue when we hope for things of God. But when we hope for things that are creatures or attachments, it becomes a passion. As St. Thomas Aquinas said, with the passion of hope, the object of hope is a future good, something that we desire. It's difficult, but possible to obtain. Now, a thing is possible to obtain in two ways. First, by ourselves, and secondly, by of others. Therefore, insofar as we hope for anything as being possible to us by means of divine assistance, our hope attains God himself, on whose help it leans. It is therefore evident that hope is also a virtue, since it causes a human act to be good and to attain its due rule. With this chapter, St. John begins his discussion of the dark night of the will. He tells us that we need to darken the will and become detached from it in order to discipline our will and to make it perfect in the virtue of charity. Please remember that love is a part of charity. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, with thy whole soul, and with thy whole strength. St. John tells us that this verse encapsulates everything we need to do and all that he has instructed us. To obey this command is to employ all of our faculties, all of our desires, operations, and passions with God, so that all the ability and strength of our souls will not serve any other purpose. Scripture says, I will keep my strength to thee, O Lord. Our souls have passions and desires that are governed by our wills, and having passions isn't necessarily a bad thing. Passions can be a good thing when we direct them toward God and turn them away from all that is not God. In this way, the strength of our souls is maintained for God, and our souls are able to love God with all our strength. The four passions of the will are joy, hope, grief, and fear. When our passions are controlled by our reason and orthodoxy, so that our souls joyfully rejoice only for the honor and glory of God, and we hope for nothing else, and we don't grieve for anything except when we see God not being glorified, and we don't fear anything except God, the strength and ability of our souls is directed toward God and saved for Him. The more our souls rejoice and have joy in things other than God, the less strength our souls will have when we finally do turn toward God. On the other hand, the more hope we have in other things, such as creatures, the less hope we will have in God. It's the same thing with the other passions. These four passions have greater dominion in the soul and assail it more vehemently when the will is less strongly attached to God and more dependent upon creatures. For then we rejoice very readily at things that don't merit rejoicing, hope in things that bring no profit, grieve over things in which perhaps we ought to rejoice, and fear where there is no reason for fearing. When our passions aren't kept in check, all sorts of vices and imperfections can come to us. And on the other hand, when our passions are ordered and composed and focused on God, greater virtue will come from that. In the same way that each one of the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, affect the others, so do the four passions. If we are able to control just one of them with our reason, the rest are going to be more controlled. We may not experience each of these passions in the same level, but as one goes, the others will follow. That's because the passions are so closely and intimately united to one another that the actual direction of one very strongly affects the direction of the others. If one is controlled, the other three will also become proportionately controlled. If the will rejoices in anything, it will have, as a result, hope for more of the same thing to the same extent of its rejoicing. And herein are virtually included grief and fear with regard to the same thing. On the other hand, as the desire for these is taken away, fear and grief concerning them are likewise gradually lost, and hope for them is removed. So as one of these passions descend, they all descend. When one is lifted up toward God, they will all be lifted up. If our hope disappears, our joy, fear, and grief will also disappear. And if our hope ever returns, then the others will also return. So, whichever direction, as we said, any of these passions goes, the whole soul and the will and also the other faculties are going to follow. It will be as if they were held captive by our passions. So we must put aside joy, hope, fear, and grief that is not directed toward God. And if we don't rein in these passions, we won't be able to remain in tranquility and peace. As we've stated in a past chapter, this is important. And St. John is going to provide us with the conditions we need in order to receive wisdom via natural and supernatural means. So we talked very briefly in a past installment how it's important not to be on a roller coaster of emotions and passions. And St. John's going to explain in these coming chapters why this is so. He's also going to provide us with more complete instructions concerning the first of the passions, joy. This instruction is important because divine union includes purging the will of passions not related to God. We will need to transform our will from a base human will to mirror the will of God. Well, I hope you enjoyed this installment of Ascent of Mount Carmel. We'll be back again in about a week with another one, but in the meantime, please pray for the church.
Passion is no ordinary